Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tracx webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing the skinny on social media monitoring at Mondelez. And I am your moderator, Rebecca Lombardo with Tracx. We are going to go ahead and get started now. I'm the Director of Strategic Services, and we are very excited to have with us today Nazli Adiran. She's the Senior Manager of North America Consumer Conversations at Mondelez. Nazli, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure, yes. Hi. I manage the North American Consumer Conversations team here at Mondelez International, as you mentioned. Just a little history on Mondelez, as a lot of people have not heard of it. In 2012, Kraft decided to split in two, spinning off the mature North American grocery business to create a global snack food business. The larger global business, which includes Oreo, Cadbury, Wheat Thins, Trident Gum, Sour Patch Kids, and several other brands, is named Mondelez International. So part of my functions responsibilities at Mondelez is social media operations and reporting, as well as other consumer touchpoints like our contact center and our Contact Us website. I hope you'll find the content today interesting and helpful, and we'll probably have various expertise on the call today. So I'll make sure that I cover some basics and then talk about reporting metrics. For anyone who pulls together or looks at social media reports, it's also very important to understand paid media. So I'll be covering that at a high level as well. Rebecca?
Thank you so much. And just so everyone knows, we are using the hashtag Tracx webinar today. That's TRACX webinar on Twitter, so you can follow the conversation there. And for questions, if you want to submit those online, go ahead and pop them in at any time. However, we'll be addressing the questions at the end of the webinar today. So I'm going to hand it over back to Nazli, who's going to start by telling us that it's very important to take time to listen.
Okay, let's begin. Before launching any social media accounts or programs, it's very important to stop and consider the full operational implications. We need to take time to listen to how consumers discuss our brands across social channels, regardless of whether you choose to activate on those specific channels. Listening can help you identify positive conversations around your brand, which you can consider amplifying or being a part of. And it can also help identify causes for concern as well as issues. The trends may help identify your barriers to purchase, which is one of the key elements in the consumer's journey at arriving to his or her purchase decision. Next slide. All of us agree here that social media listening and reporting is super important. But what exactly do we use to measure? There are at least half a dozen types of metrics: posts, interactions, engagement, reach, density, fans. The answer to what to report depends on what you're trying to answer. If you're trying to determine insight based on conversations, then posts and interactions might make more sense. I'll provide examples of this later in the webinar, but if you're trying to find out if a piece of content or a campaign is a success, reach is the most important metric. Next slide. Let's start by getting some clear definitions so that we're all on the same page. What exactly is social media reach? Well, like any media channel, reach equals the total number of people who actually see your content. Organic reach is the number of our fans and their connections who naturally see any any piece of content we post. Paid reach, on the other hand, is the number of people who see content when we pay to promote it. Next slide. Reach is not the same as fans or followers. I think we need to be clear on that. And with a good paid media strategy, reach can be a lot higher getting you in front of a large percentage of your target audience and not just some percentage of your brand's followers. Frequency is how often people see your content over a period. When we look across the Mondelez brands, insufficient reach is the single biggest reason digital marketing fails to have business impact. So no matter how great of a digital activity, if only a small number of people see it, there'll only be a small impact on sales. Well, what about increasing the number of fans? Isn't that important? Next slide. The reality is that fans aren't what drives business results. We know this based on research. In the early days of social media listening, and I remember this around 7 or 8 years ago, one way to drive reach was to increase your fan base and hope and pray that people would share your content. But now that we can pay to drive content to a targeted audience, fan base has become much less important in tracking social media metrics. The only time a large fan base might help you is for those new to the content or the page, with the fan numbers acting like endorsement. Next slide. Facebook carried out a very interesting study of several consumer goods campaigns using loyalty card data to measure the impact on sales. These campaigns were all supported by paid media to make sure they drove meaningful reach to their target audience. The research showed that while on average fans spent 2 times more than non-fans, ultimately they'll still only account for only 1% of your total sales. I'll let that sink in a little bit. It's an important finding here. On the next slide, so no matter how large your fan base, it'll still remain pretty small compared to the total audience it can reach through platforms like Facebook. Next slide. As I said at the start of this session, before reporting on social media, it's also very important to learn how media works. There are 3 types of media: owned, earned, and paid. And just to recap their definition, owned media is the digital property like your social media sites. Earned media is social media comments, news stories, or reviews. Paid media is the sponsored content or paid social influencers. Paid is our focus in driving reach. Next slide. Here are some core considerations on your next campaign, mainly applicable to Facebook. Let's go through each one of these. During a campaign, it's important to target broadly. Although social media channels can allow us to pinpoint a very specific consumer, a campaign should be about reaching consumers at meaningful scale. Overall, we recommend spending as much of your media budget on media reach and as little on the creation of the content itself. Having said that, as the content is likely going to be seen by millions of consumers, it's important to make sure that it's high quality. One way that becomes possible is that you probably need fewer execution than you think, and only as many as you can afford to promote. Even on a platform like Facebook, this might be no more than 1 post per week. The recommended length of a campaign is around 6 to 8 weeks, though you may drive most of your reach through a small number of high reach days. The goal is to optimize your media on a cost per thousand basis and not cost per click basis. I know this isn't always the case, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb to know. We're really not trying to drive consumers to a new destination by having them click on something, but instead try to get in front of as many of them as possible. High unique reach is a bigger priority than high frequency. Let's talk a little bit about continuity. So continuity, also known as always on, is also an important element. Less number of frequency, no more than 2 to 4 posts per month. While paid media through social channels is cost effective, the high volume reach goal can come at a price. But thinking of social media as a business changing channel can potentially mean large increases in your budget. So once you can prove that your paid media drove reach, then you probably are going to be able to get some additional funds to support it. Next slide. So what does the role of earned and media play? Owned refers to the people who see content on your page and channels, and earned content is the reach gained as people share your content. Typically, earned and owned will only be a small additional percentage on top of paid reach, and we don't recommend relying on them. Earned and owned are a great source for qualitative data used for social listening, not quantitative metrics that may define your brand or campaign success. Next slide. Engagement has been used as a primary measure of social media activity for initially. Engagement, as you know, refers to active actions such as likes, shares, comments, also known as digital actions. We want people to be mentally engaged with our brands, but that's not the same as needing people to click on our content. We can engage consumers by them just seeing our content. Digital actions should not be used as a key measure for our campaigns or our brand success or failure. It's so tempting, though, to rely on digital actions because there's so much data available. But the reality is that digital actions don't overall correlate with sales. Just because the data is there doesn't make it valuable to track and assume success with high numbers. Next slide. Social influencers as part of your overall paid media campaign is also an important driver to increasing reach. Influencers with really large social followers can get millions of views on any content they produce. Working with influencers usually involves authentically working with their interests and not just forcing them to post our standard brand messaging. Teaming up with influencers allows us to benefit from their scale. Next slide, please. A couple of years ago, we introduced a new framework to measure success for Mondelez brands. We focused on reach and asked whether we are achieving the right levels of reach and frequency to achieve our business goals. Then we looked at resonance, whether the activity is positively impacting the brand metrics and wider perceptions. Digital actions here, like engagement, will give you some clues on this, but typically we should probably carry out a post-campaign research survey to truly monitor this. Finally, we looked at reaction. Does it result in an uplift in sales, ROI, and other brand metrics? This can be hard to model, but specific tests and research opportunities are available in the market. And you should probably, if you have one, engage your consumer research team for assistance. Next slide, please. I wanted to share an example of a paid media campaign and the results. Oreo Thins. In July 2015, we introduced Oreo Thins to drive incremental growth. We describe it as a classic Oreo taste and a thin and crispy texture. We positioned Oreo Thins for success by investing big behind the launch and supported a 3 SKU platform launch in 2015. Oreo Thins Chocolate Sandwich, the Golden, and the Mint. And they're delicious if you haven't tried them. The significant investment focused on driving awareness and trial and reaching new adult consumers. With amazing results so far, Oreo Thins has driven additional household penetration for the brand. So very exciting for us. Our mission at the time was to get those consumers who left us in childhood, next slide, sorry, and have them reevaluate Oreo and try and get them to experience the new side of Oreo. Oreo Thins plan at launch included TV, social, digital, influencer, and PR. For the purpose of this webinar, we'll focus on examples of what Mondelez used for social and influencers. Next slide. For social, we used always on. If you remember from the previous slides, that is the continuity phase. For social, we used always on paid support, custom targeting, and teamed up with Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get the message out. The content was bold, visual, and attention grabbing. Next slide. We also teamed up with a lifestyle site to seed the product endorsement and extend awareness. We wanted to make sure the content was authentic and straight true to the voice of the influencer. We targeted big with a mass reach. Next slide, please. So what were the results? How do we report success? As I mentioned before, the type of analysis to determine social media results depends on the business question. Metric results, mainly reach, which is what we've been talking about, is tied to business results. On the other hand, conversation analysis or insight results will help you dig further on opportunities and trends. The insight results is an important added layer of detail needed to make sure you're going the right direction with your brand and your content. Let's review some top-level results based on these two types of reports. Next slide. As you remember from the reach and frequency pages earlier in the webinar, the optimal campaign is around 6 to 8 weeks, followed by a continuity phase with less frequency in content, also known as always on. This chart shows reach from launch starting in July 2015 and ending in September, with a total reach of 47 million. So that's a lot. Another metric that we should add to the results here on this slide is the cost per thousand rate. The cost per thousand data will allow you to benchmark previous or future campaign results for your brand. So it's an important benchmark to keep. To develop a similar chart like this, please work with your Tracx account manager. Next slide. The insight results or qualitative results can be the most interesting. While there isn't necessarily a direct correlation with posts and interaction volume and sales, it's a good source to find out some whys. There was a low-level doubt brewing within social media about Oreo Thins delivering on taste. But once launched and trial began, consumers shifted their perception to more positive. The insight on why we launched Oreo Thins was because regular Oreo wasn't right for these adult consumers. We felt that Oreo Thins was someone who likes regular Oreos but wants a lighter texture. But the listening reports show a different story around feeling less guilty, even though we did not want to market it that way. The point of this slide is that post and interaction data is extremely rich with data, with insight, I should say. Next slide, please. So let's summarize the key learnings from this webinar. It's important that you take the time to listen to the conversations before and after campaign launch. Really understand the metrics for success like reach and cost per thousand. It's also important to understand how paid media works and why it's important. Depending on your role, you'll need to determine the frequency during the campaign and in the continuity phase. And finally, identify areas of opportunity before, during, and after launch by listening. Thanks for your time, everyone. I hope this has been helpful.
Thank you so much for that. That was very helpful. Um, we have just a few questions coming in that I want to make sure that we speak to. One of which is on the topic of reach. You had mentioned that reach is the most important metric to pay attention to. What are some of the strategies that we can take away if we see reach is going down or maybe plateauing? What are some suggestions or what are some actions that might work?
Good question. There's probably many reasons why reach will go down at some point. I'm guessing during or beyond the 6 to 8 week campaign period. The most obvious answer that I can think of is that you're no longer investing in paid reach, so less people are seeing the content. Or it might be that your content isn't useful, valuable, or relevant anymore. There are a number of online resources that talk about how to address the last point around making your content more valuable. For example, some talk about the 80-20 rule. 80% of your posts should be valuable and 20% self-promotional. That was one example. Or making sure that your posts delight the consumers. So there's different things that might be brewing in there and to answer your question.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. We have another one here about how you would go about amplifying positive conversations. You had spoken to this earlier when you talked about, kind of finding a positive message or, taking something that's going well and pushing it further. What's the best way to amplify a positive message or conversation?
That's also a very good question. I would say the best way to amplify positive conversations is just by being social. Um, Interact with your consumers in an authentic way, as quickly as you can. Try to speak in the brand voice if you can. Share the energy and the excitement. Using things like hashtags or a call to action will also help spread that. Those are some little suggestions.
Okay, great. And do the social media conversations that you identify, maybe in your insights analysis, do they get leveraged to make product decisions, marketing decisions?
The social media conversation for us are important in really providing the qualitative insight that can help make product decisions, absolutely. Um, Obviously we recommend the conversations can be looked at before, during, and after a campaign. For us, one of the key learnings was the sentiment shift. So more positive conversations occurred once consumers started to try the product.
So do you think it's okay to maybe, kind of wait and see, and then, once you see that positive trend starting, then kind of, jump in and take a closer look at those insights?
Absolutely. I think we should be looking at the data continuously. Obviously it depends on your resources, but if you have the opportunity to look at the data daily or weekly, that is definitely recommended. For us right now, we're looking at the data usually for campaigns on a weekly basis. So it depends on what level of resource you have available to you.
Great. So let's visit the topic about digital actions again, because I know measurements around engagement have been kind of a hotly debated topic. So, if digital actions like engagement are not necessarily a measure of brand success, what is? And are sales and reach all that matters or just a part of it?
I think I need to just clarify that. I'm not saying that we should entirely dismiss digital actions. While reach is the most important metric that we need to invest in as a company, resonance and reaction, which are the other two I mentioned, are also important. Resonance, which measures whether the activity is positively impacting the brand metrics and the brand's perception. As I said before, can be measured with a post-survey campaign. Reaction is developing a model that shows whether the campaign resulted in an uplift in sales. And that's a harder one to do, but again, there are companies out there that can assist you with that.
Great. And let's talk a little bit about tools. What are some of the tools that help measure success? And then how do you combine metrics from different areas, maybe even from a native platform in combination with a social media tool?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it feels like right now there's not one tool that can do both. So one tool is extremely good at one thing and another tool is extremely good at something else. So a lot of companies are using multiple tools to get to the right data. So we use Tracx for digging for the valuable insight and the qualitative data. We also use another tool called Expion, and this is a good tool to measure your paid media reach and your cost per thousand. You can have your ads account connected to the tool for easy tracking.
Yes, I'm just going to throw a little note into that as well. Tracks can also provide custom reporting around qualitative and quantitative data as well. So thank you for that. Do those insights that you see, do they get weighted equally with quantitative data, or do those go to different departments?
I think that the qualitative data is an added important layer that must go on top of quantitative. Quantitative is not going to give you the full story, and it's not necessarily going to solve your business question. So digging in the posts and interactions will give you clues to help answer the business questions. So I think they're both important in creating a full story of what's going on with the business or the brand.
And at what point do you consider like a spike in positive sentiment to be a spike versus like a new normal or new normalization data?
Spikes. I guess it depends on the volatility of your brand or your campaign. For post and interaction, we generally wait a few days to a week. If it's just a spike, it'll die down within a few days. But if it's a new sort of plateau, then it will stay longer than that.
And then, so speaking of a few days and watching that part, how early into the launch do you do your first reporting?
I guess it depends on who's doing it. I mean, we have right now internal teams that look at the data. We have external digital agencies that are tracking the data. Um, I'm assuming that the digital agencies that help with execution are much more keen at looking at the data on a daily basis, whereas for us within the consumer conversations team, we would maybe do it. We would either do it on a weekly basis or we would wait until the 6 to 8 weeks campaign is done and then do a post sort of analysis.
Okay. And I just want to address another question that came in about a slide that you had up earlier regarding your influencers. Can you just touch upon that again regarding um, how you work with influencers, how you choose them and reach out to them, and briefly touch on that again?
Sure. So, I mean, influencers is another important aspect in your paid media. For us, it's obviously making sure that what the influencer has to say is in line with our brand objectives. So, finding the right influencer is a tricky business because we want to make sure that they are a right partner for us and that they will speak authentically and stay true to the voice of themselves without being, we don't want them to simply be our mouthpiece, right? We want them to continue to be authentic. I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, yeah. So that means, you're not feeding them the lines. You're not, saying this is the brand message, we want you to
No,
speak on. It's that crossover between what their voice is for themselves, what commonalities they have with their audience, and what your product brings to the table, kind of finding that overlap or that mutual point of interest. Is that right?
exactly, exactly.
And do you find that that's been a big help with something like the launch of Oreo Thins in terms of reach?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the tactics that was used for the Oreo Thins launch, along with paid content. So those were the two main drivers of increasing reach. Um, they'll have millions of followers, so it was really taking advantage of their scale.
And you had mentioned using a tool like Tracx and how you use Tracx to be able to create the earned attention within that campaign. So, for example, if an influencer, engages around this topic and their followers and fan base post original content and mention the brand, um, you're able to drill in and find those activities, those social posts through Tracks, and be able to see the language they use or the images they use, and you're taking that feedback as well. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Essentially, any conversation related to whether it's keyword, whether it's a hashtag that's associated to a campaign is all being looked at. And we're looking at trends at a high level. And I think there was enough data there, rich data there that we found a lot more insight that's there on the slide. That was just a snapshot.
Great. I'm just going to allow a couple more minutes for another question to come in. But is there anything that we chatted about today that you wanted to make sure we wrapped up with, or anything? I think the Oreo Thins example is a great example. Again, it was such a wide reach. There was such a strong combination of paid and earned. Are there any kind of overall lessons learned?
I mean, for me, I think the biggest lesson in social media reporting or I guess, to ensure that you truly understand how media works. So it should be okay, one person's in charge of reporting and off you go. It's more really understanding the role of media, what their goals are, so that, we're not only focusing on conversations, that we're really trying to see what are some metrics that are really important to the business and incorporating that within our conversation analysis. I'd say that's probably the key message here in this webinar.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that's all of our questions for today. I wanted to thank Nasli for joining us from Mondelez as we reviewed the skinny on social media monitoring. If you have any questions that didn't get addressed or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to Tracx on Twitter. Our handle is @Tracx. And we also wanted to make sure everybody knew that this recording will be available after it has concluded today. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope you've enjoyed today's webinar. Have a great day.